And then the recording and session materials afterwards, as always, will be available on the NDE website. And then just one more reminder to, if you have not already in your Zoom username, please add your school. And it's helpful for us, especially if your school has a name that is common, like there's an elementary and middle and high school that have a similar name. It's helpful if you can indicate if it's elementary, middle, etc. It just helps us with breakout rooms and kind of monitoring who was able to attend. Okay, one other quick note, Nadia is not able to join us today. She is traveling, I believe, to Kentucky for some other work. So it'll just be me and Liz and Senya here with you today. Okay. Also, if I look really tired, it's because my 1-year-old daughter decided to not sleep a lot last night. So we're all a little bit on the struggle bus here. Okay, jumping into today's session. We've spent the last 3 sessions deep diving into grade level assignments. So we learned about grade level assignments, we did a mini audit, and then we did a consultancy protocol around that. Today, we're shifting gears a little bit to focus on our second focus area of the year, which is strong instruction. We're going to spend some time today internalizing the critical role of strong instruction in advancing equity for all students. Then we're going to do a little bit of practice, observing for culturally responsive and grade level practices. And then finally, we'll end by starting to plan out some of the logistics of collecting video clips for our April session. So your pre-work for April is going to be to collect videos. We're going to take some time today to kind of map out how and when you'll do that. So you should leave with a bit of an action plan. As always, here is a quick reminder of our norms. I'd love everyone to just take 30 seconds to yourself, identify 1 or 2 of these that feels particularly essential for you today, and thinking about what do you need to keep front of mind to make the most of today's learning. Okay, with that, we will just dive right in. All right, so just a quick connection to some learning we did previously, kind of going all the way back to our very first session together in November, I think it was. In that first session, we dug into some data revealed by TNTP study, the opportunity myth. And we started a conversation around the 4 key resources that influence a student's school experience and outcomes. And those 4 key resources were grade level assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and high expectations. So like I mentioned, we've spent a lot of time so far this year talking about the importance of grade level assignments, but we know that that alone is not enough. The opportunity myth revealed that even in classrooms where students had access to those grade level appropriate assignments, those same students were often still missing out on strong instruction, especially opportunities to sort of do the thinking in their lessons. So that's kind of what we're zooming in on today. And just a kind of quick visual of what's coming down the pipeline. Today, we're talking about how to kind of evaluate strong instruction in ELA and math. And then when we meet again in April, we'll do another mini audit, except this time we'll be looking at instructional videos instead of grade level assignments. So similar process we've already been through, just with a different focus area. So let's kick off with an exercise. In your note catcher, you have links to 2 video clips, which we're also going to be putting in the chat. Select one of these to watch, ELA or math, just based on whichever content you're more comfortable with. And then as you watch the video, it's about 7 minutes long. Think about whether or not you would define this lesson as strong instruction. And just rely on your own definition of strong instruction, your own gut instincts, prior knowledge. Don't overthink it. But do be prepared to share some of your thinking in a breakout group after we watch the video. So as I mentioned, the video is only about 7 minutes long. At the end of it, you're going to be prompted with a quick multiple choice question that just asks yes or no. Do you think this is strong instruction? I do want to name that 7 minutes is generally, like in real life, we probably wouldn't go into a teacher's classroom for 7 minutes and say like, oh, I saw enough to evaluate this teacher, right? But we have limited time here today. So we're only going to watch 7 minutes of what is actually a full like 20 to 30-minute clip, just because our time is limited. But we did want to name that we picked these 7 minutes in particular because they're kind of representative of the rest of the lesson as a whole. So after 7 minutes of independent time, we're going to be sending you to some breakout rooms for a quick discussion before we come back whole group. Are there any questions about where to find these videos? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start my timer for 7 minutes, and then we'll send you to breakout. All right, that was a little over 7 minutes. Hopefully you had a chance to watch most of the video, if not the whole thing. We're gonna send you, Sanya's gonna send you in just a moment to a random breakout room of anywhere from 2 to 3 people. Once you're in your breakout, we'd love for you to take about 3 minutes chatting about whether you defined the lesson you observed, whether it was ELA or math, as strong instruction, and share with your group how you arrived at that conclusion. So what metrics did you personally use to kind of determine if you thought that this lesson was strong? And then we'll come back in 3 minutes.
This concludes our severe weather drill.
Is being recorded. Meeting is being recorded.
All right, before we head to our next section, and as people are continuing to come back from breakout, I would love to hear from maybe one person who watched the ELA video and one person who watched the math video. Did you think this was strong instruction? Like, what's your gut reaction and why? Go ahead and just come off mute to share out.
I watched the math video and I said, no, it was not strong instruction. Very fast paced, hardly any student interaction, and it was very much teacher led.
Thank you. What about ELA?
I watched the ELA and I thought it was strong instruction, a lot of interaction and partner work with students. monitoring of instruction, and the students had great recall of information that was text evidence based and in their own words, which I always think is great because you know that they're comprehending things and able to retain it.
Thank you guys for sharing. We're going to come back to those videos in a couple of minutes and kind of share what sort of the master ratings were for them. But before we do that, we want to take a little bit of time to preview the tools that we're going to be using to evaluate those videos. So in your note catcher, you have links to both the ELA observation tool and the math observation tool. It will be helpful. It'll probably be helpful for you to go ahead and have one of those open based on whichever video you watched. So some quick background on where these tools come from. These tools are adapted from TNTP's ELA and math instructional walkthrough tools, and we adapted them a little bit just for Nebraska context. So you can find a version of these tools on the TNTP website, but they'll look a little bit different. Their intention is to help clarify a vision for skillful literacy and mathematics teaching and learning. And they're grounded in research about how students best learn to either make sense of what they're reading in an ELA classroom or become more mathematical thinkers in their math classrooms. We want to be clear about what these tools are and are not. So these observation tools are a helpful guide for planning lessons, reflecting on or giving feedback on instructional practices, and developing professional learning on standards-aligned practices. A common theme here is that all of these activities zoom in on content-specific knowledge and development. So if your goal is kind of that content-specific development, these tools can be really helpful. These particular observation tools are not, however, intended to be used to formally evaluate teachers, to provide comprehensive feedback on all aspects of teaching and learning, or to replace any existing observation or coaching tools that you might be using. As we get into the tools, you're probably gonna have some thoughts like, hey, a bunch of things about teaching are missing from this tool. Like checks for understanding, for example, are like not included anywhere in this tool. That's because it's not intended to be a comprehensive evaluative tool. It's more about that content-specific knowledge and skill development. I'll pause here for a second. Are there any questions about what these tools are and are not useful for? Okay. One other quick thing I wanted to mention is that both the ELA and the math observation tools have the same 4 domains. So even if you only dig into one today, you'll be able to kind of easily make sense of the other one on your own because they follow a very similar structure. So the 4 domains they both have are culture of learning, content, which includes the text in ELA classrooms, instructional practices that are best for the content area, and then finally, student ownership. Some of these domains might seem a bit familiar to you, especially as we start getting into the tool, and that's because they're pretty well aligned to the domains of the assignment review tools that we looked at in December and January. So you're gonna see some repeated content around like, what's the high quality text kids are using in an ELA classroom. We talked about that in the assignment review protocol, and we're going to talk about that again with the strong instruction tool as well. So you should see some overlap there. Another key element of these observation tools that we want to call out is their inclusion of culturally responsive teaching practices. So culturally responsive teaching, I feel like is a sort of like a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot these days. And people tend to have like different sort of understandings and definitions of it. So we wanted to make sure we're clear on what we mean when we talk about it. So culturally responsive teaching is an approach to teaching that prioritizes helping students reach deeper levels of understanding, regardless of students' backgrounds or kind of like culturally how they make sense of information. To be clear, culturally responsive teaching is not the same thing as multicultural education, which focuses on celebrating diversity. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching demands that teachers think about how all of their students can access and master rigorous content. So these observation tools that we're looking at incorporate culturally responsive teaching by centering student engagement and ownership over their own learning in service of developing independent rather than dependent learners. So all of the domains in these tools, particularly the culture of learning and student ownership domains, are really focused on not just like student participation in the lesson, but how much of the thinking and meaning making are students kind of taking on their own in any given lesson. All right, for this next segment, we're actually going to split into two groups. One group will be staying in this room, and we will be diving into the ELA observation tool and discussing ratings for the ELA video. So if you watch the ELA video, you're going to stay in this room. The other group in a breakout room will do the same thing with the math observation tool and the math video. So if you watch the math video at this time, I believe Senya is going to go ahead and open an opt-in math breakout room. So if you watch the math video, go ahead and join that breakout with Liz. If you click on, you should be able to click like, there should be an icon, I think, for like breakout room or something where you can opt in to join one. If you're not able to do that, just put it in the chat and we'll manually add you. So Kara, let me add you right now. 1, 2, math. There we go.
Hey, Senya and Arisha, I don't have screen sharing permissions, I realized, in my breakout.
Oh.
You need to become a host. Sorry to interrupt.
I thought that I made you a host. Senya, while I figure out this screen sharing thing, can you add the folks in the chat who want to be added to math? Okay, Liz, I made you a co-host. Hopefully that should work.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, anyone else need to be added to the math room? Okay, so if you're in this room, we are talking about ELA. Oh, Chrissy, there we go. Let me move you, math. There we go. Goodbye, Chrissy. Okay, if you're in this room, we're talking about ELA. So we're gonna go ahead and dive in. You will need your note catcher and the ELA observation tool, which is linked in your note catcher. Okay, so we're just gonna go through domain by domain and talk about how you would rate the ELA video that you watched a moment ago for that particular domain, and we'll kind of hash it out, and I'll share the master ratings for each domain, some of which might surprise you. So this first domain, the culture of learning domain, helps us answer the question, are all students engaged in the work from start to finish? It includes indicators that are focused on students' engagement with the work, but also on kind of how they're engaging with their teacher and their peers. A quick note that these ratings of not yet, somewhat, mostly, and yes are aligned to generally the percentages of students that we see engaged. So if you observe, let's say, half of a class engaged in the work from start to finish, you would rate that lesson as somewhat meeting expectations because it falls in that 50%. So take a minute or two to review the indicators for domain A, culture of learning, and share in the chat how you would rate the 12th grade ELA lesson that we watched and why. So would you rate this as not yet, somewhat, mostly, or yes, and why? And then we'll talk about it after a couple of minutes. All right, I'm seeing few yeses and one not yet. Yep. Okay, interesting. I want to come back to what, let's see, Kristen brought up and Liz's response to that. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But you guys are, for the most part, like pretty spot on here. The master ratings for this put this particular lesson at yes for domain A, culture of learning. It's clear even in just we only watched 7 minutes, right, of the full 20 to 30 minute lesson, video, but even in just those 7 minutes, it's pretty clear that this classroom has a strong culture of learning. Students are following expectations and directions set by the teacher. They're engaged in the conversation, and it's evident that the teacher has strong relationships with her students. Even though a couple of the indicators are rated mostly rather than yes, overall, we could still say that this particular lesson is rated as a yes. A quick note, a couple of the things that Kristen brought up in the chat, like when students are asking for clarification, they're asking the teacher, they're not necessarily like relying on each other for that. And then Liz's response to that was that, yes, she agrees, but she dings that in a different area. And that is kind of what I want to emphasize here. Those things are true, Kristen, that you noted, but we're going to see that show up as kind of a lower rating in a different domain. But as far as engagement and the general culture of the classroom, we'd say, yes, this classroom seems to have a pretty strong culture. Anyone want to add anything or kind of other reflections on the culture of learning using this tool? Okay, that one was easy. Let's move on to the second domain, content. So this domain helps us answer, is this lesson focused on a high quality text? That is the most important thing we want to be thinking about in an ELA classroom, those high quality text. Remember that this domain is pretty closely aligned to the assignment review tool. So it focuses on whether a grade level engaging text is central to the ELA lesson. So let's do the same exercise again. Take a couple of minutes to review the indicators for domain B, and then share in the chat how you would rate that 12th grade ELA lesson and why. All right, I see a couple of yeses in the chat. Does anyone disagree? All right, I see some, well, let me just call on some people to share. Kelly, since your name is on my screen last, would you mind coming off mute and sharing kind of your rationale for why you rated this a yes?
Sure. Well, I thought that the students were speaking about the specific character types for literature or pop culture. They had to come up with a different character type. And I also felt that the complexity level for the seniors was at an appropriate level. And then the conversations, they had to draw on their previous knowledge as well and apply it to the assignment. So that's why I voted it as a yes.
Does anyone want to add to that? I feel like what Kelly shared is kind of what I saw in some of the other comments here as well. Okay. Oh, Kristen, go ahead.
Sorry, I agree that they did have to apply what they had talked about previously and learned. I think what maybe is lacking is any like referring back to the text itself. That's something like we never saw them have to look at the physical text and quote anything or point out a specific example from the text. It was really just like applying the literary terms to real life, not the text.
I'm glad you named that because, surprise, surprise, the master rating for this is actually a not yet, primarily because of what Kristen just shared. So this lesson, and I also, the first time I watched this, I also rated this a yes, because I was like, oh, they're making so many references to so many different things, like that's gotta count. But this lesson is actually a great example of one where the culture is really strong, and kids are really engaged, and it might be really easy to assume that everything in a lesson is strong because of that. But this tool really helps us think about the other aspects, like the quality of the content. So this lesson is rated a not yet because of what Kristen named. Students are not discussing any particular text. Instead, they're referencing characters from popular movies and books, like some of which are text, but some of which are not, right? Like they're just coming up with like random examples. Nothing wrong with that. That just doesn't meet the bar of this particular domain. The teacher does reference what seems to be the text they're reading, Othello, but she makes all of those connections herself. So this video actually goes on for another like 20 minutes on this particular conversation. So if we'd watched the whole thing, you'd get a better sense of like nearly 30 minutes of this class period is spent on instruction that's not focused on a high quality text. And when we say focus on a high quality text, that means students are kind of articulating and making those connections, pulling out specific evidence. There were even a couple of instances where a student may have made a connection to another text, right? But the teacher didn't always push this. The thing that I had to learn the first time I watched this video was that references to text do not count as the lesson being anchored on a high quality text. So just because kind of students are throwing out references, unless domain. I'll pause here for a second. Are there any questions, reactions, comments about this domain? Okay, if you do have questions as we go through the rest of these domains, please do pop off mute. I will say for ELA in particular, whether or not the lesson is focused on a high quality text really does impact how we think about the rest of the lesson. So when we're using this tool, we really want to make sure this domain B, that we're thinking about it pretty critically, because it's going to influence how we rate later on in the domain. So if you say no for, or sorry, if you say yes for domain B, it's probably likely that you might end up kind of misidentifying some other indicators. So if you're unclear on why this is a not yet for complex text, please do come off mute so we can kind of have a conversation about it. Okay, now let's look at the third domain, practices. So this domain helps us answer, does the lesson employ practices employ questions and tasks that integrate the grade level standards and build students' comprehension of the text and its meaning? This domain is also tightly tied to the assignment review protocol we looked at, in that it focuses on how students are engaging with the what. So how are they thinking about kind of the text digging into? So take a minute or two to review the indicators for domain C and share in the chat how you might rate the 12th grade ELA lesson. Let's go ahead. I would love to just hear kind of like where are you landing? Like top half, bottom half, what do we think? Great. I love kind of what I'm seeing.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I went to student ownership. So ignore my answer. I apologize for that.
That is all right. You're ahead of us. I'm going to actually call on Liz. Can you voice over a little bit of what you shared in the chat?
Sure. I was trying to, I just kind of went through to look at each of those 5 separate areas down below, and ultimately didn't feel like students were wrestling with a worthwhile question, which is that C1, the very first one. I mean, this is more of just a connection piece, and I think it was fortuitous that the student identified Rodrigo from Othello as someone who fit this fool archetype. I had wondered about if some of the knowledge demands, so I rated that as somewhat, on C2, maybe we're being neat just to help kids with that background knowledge piece and making that connection, but otherwise thinking about the rest of the qualitative measures in terms of meaning and purpose, language and structure. None of the lesson was focused on that. They didn't have to demonstrate understanding in order to support their ideas. Students didn't have to attend to lines of text, much like Kristen had said earlier. Students weren't using text evidence to support what they thought. So I ended up with not yet on this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. You're pretty spot on there. So students are asked to identify characters who fit the archetype of the fool. But because, and I think Kristen maybe named this in the chat, because there is no like core anchor text present, it's really hard to score higher than a somewhat on this domain if domain B is not yet. Because you'll notice if you look at the specific language of each of these indicators, they reference a text, right? Indicator C1 references deep understanding of the text. C5 references deepen students' understanding of the text. So if we said on domain B that there is no high quality anchor text, it's going to be really hard to score higher here. So for that primary reason, a lot of these indicators are rated at not yet. I could absolutely see an argument for rating some of these at somewhat, or potentially even the overall rating being somewhat. I think like the difference between a not yet and a somewhat versus a mostly and a yes is kind of small. I think what you want to first think about is, am I putting this in the not yet somewhat bucket, or am I putting this in the mostly yes bucket? So if you landed on somewhat for some of these, that's still pretty on track and spot on here. I'll pause for a second. Questions about this domain?
I just think all of this is really hard because I feel like we needed like a lot of background knowledge to the lesson and what they were working on to truly answer some of this accurately.
Is there a particular indicator or part of this domain that you're thinking about?
No, it's just, I didn't know what the focus text was. You know, are they focused on a standard to where, okay, are you able to identify a character, you know, that would be considered a fool? I didn't know, you know, the background text that was supporting it. So this has been a little bit hard, but I will say it really has me looking at things differently.
I also want to name that what you just shared is right. Like the fact that you couldn't tell what the text was is problematic, right? Yes, like that gives you the answer right then and there, right? The fact that you were like, I'm not sure what the anchor text was, tells you that at least in this clip that we watched, we don't know the rest of the lesson. We're not expanding that. But just in this clip that we watched, if you couldn't tell if there was an anchor text, then there probably wasn't, right? And for that particular moment in time that we're evaluating, that would kind of lead us to some of these not yet for that part. Okay, I do want to get us to our break in just a minute or two. So let's quickly talk about the last domain. It's a little bit easier, student ownership. This one helps us answer the question, are all students responsible for doing the thinking in the classroom? So similar to domain A, this one is rated based on the percentage of students who are owning their learning and doing the majority of the speaking, reading, writing, and complex thinking. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and share the master ratings here. So this is a domain that I also, the first time I watched this video, I rated this domain a little bit higher than what the master ratings are, because it was really stuck on me, like how, like the kids seem to love being in that classroom. Like they seemed excited to share responses. And so my gut reaction was to rate student ownership a little bit higher. But when you start to break this domain down by indicator, you start to notice that the percentage of students doing most of the complex thinking is actually on the lower end. But they are really engaged, which is why domain A we rated really highly. So it can be easy sometimes to conflate domain A and domain B, but just because engagement is high doesn't mean ownership necessarily is high. they're not having a particularly challenging discussion. The topic is so interesting and has so much potential to be a challenging discussion, but the teacher doesn't necessarily push students to get to that deeper level of thinking and conversation. She probes sometimes, but not deeply and consistently enough to lift this to a higher rating. And ultimately, the teacher is doing most of the deeper thinking. So for this one in particular, if you're stuck, to take a step back from what you're seeing and think about who's doing most of the work here, the teacher or the student? Who's doing most of the like complex thinking? Who's sharing those robust ideas? If it's the teacher, the student ownership piece is not going to be rated super high. All right, I'll pause for a second. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we will be back whole group. And then you're going to have the chance to do one. You're going to watch a different video and practice this one more time. All right, we will go ahead and get started with our next piece. We're going to do a little bit more practice, this time with a different video. I will pass it off to Liz to set us up for some practice time.
All right, so we're going to dig into some practice in small groups. Like we did before, you'll be able to choose whether you want to do ELA or math. And in a minute, I'll give you instructions about how to choose a group. But when you get in your groups, you'll be in a group of 5 or less and take just like 30 seconds to identify a timekeeper who can keep you on track and a note taker. Then you're going to watch the selected video, either ELA or math. And the links to those videos are in our CSI workbook that you have the link to. So you'll watch the video together and then work through the observation tool. And this time, and you should do this time as you watch the video as well, now that we've gone through the tool and you have that up. So as you're watching, think about your ratings and do your own ratings. And then in your group, take about 10 or 15 minutes to talk through each of your ratings and arrive at a final rating as a group. And then in your last 5 to 10 minutes, discuss what feedback you would give the teacher if you had a coaching meeting with them coming up. So we're going to open up breakout rooms. There'll be a bunch of rooms you'll see for ELA and a bunch of rooms you'll see for math. And just join one that has 5 people or less so that we end up with some small groups with your choice of either ELA or math. And again, you'll find all of the links that you need in the workbook.
I'm going to jump into our last piece. Would love to just open up whole group a conversation just to hear some reflections. So let's start with the first question here on the slide. How did the observation tool, or to what extent did the observation tool help you identify action steps for the teacher? So when you were getting to that stage of what feedback would I give this teacher, how was the tool helpful for that?
I think just going through with our small group with the teachers, it just kind of let me get a little bit more specific about certain aspects where it was broken up in parts of the lesson, where it's cultural content practice. It made me kind of identify the part in the lesson, but then it also labeled the appropriateness of that. Like, okay, we're talking about this because it affects the culture of learning. We're talking about this because it affects student ownership. So it gave more of an identity of the feedback of the part of lesson. So it's not like the majority of the lesson was this or the majority of was that. It just kind of chunked it up a little bit better. And in the specifics of how to give back instructional feedback, where sometimes people look at it and think it's their whole lesson, where it's really just this aspect and why you're hitting on it. I think that big piece is always that student ownership. How can students own their learning so they can self-regulate it, where it's not so much teacher-fed, teacher-led, but more student-led. That if we make it more categorized, then teachers can be more intentional about when they lesson plan and say, hey, how do I hit student ownership in my lesson, instead of, hey, did every student get assessed or self-check, but in that, how did I get student ownership in my assessing of the student? So for me, when I was doing this, it kind of helped give more specific areas to why certain aspects in your lessons maybe need to be hit more or maybe not as much just because of where we're at with it.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to share how the tool helped or maybe didn't help you identify action steps for the teacher?
I think this is Heather from Fontenelle. And I agree with what I've heard thus far, but it also breaks it down because it breaks it into what area the teacher has next steps needed. It's not just, there's so many things you could think of, you know, or maybe you can't think of anything, but this, you know, like we were talking about how, you know, really it's a pretty good lesson, but it's like, you know, let's kind of reel that back in and look, we're here to give feedback. So how can we give feedback? So it helps be able to look at what matters most. And it also helps because it's broken down into those areas. So it's like, it can be a very good lesson, but then it also breaks it down to where, what would be the next steps, in meaning the culture could be great in there. We thought the culture was great. You know, I mean, the kids were doing things, but then it also made us go back and think of, okay, what about how, the teacher was talking and asking questions. So it could be like everything is very aligned, but it's also very specific. So you can be like, okay, these areas are great, but if we were to do the next leverage with you, this is what we would focus on. So it helps because it pinpoints and it has you zero in. That's what I think. It just helps in that way. You can be very specific.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. Would love to hear, I'm going to bunch these last two questions together. What was challenging and or eye-opening about this process? And I'd love to hear some reflections kind of on like, how does this compare to like how you generally go into teachers' classrooms and determine what feedback to give?
So in our school, our coaching form that our leadership team uses is based on our CSI goals. And so one of the things, especially coming out of having taught in a hybrid model for a long time, is looking for engagement strategies that are being used, the level of student engagement. I think that the questions that are on this tool that you guys have created are more specific than what we are using. You know, I might look for engagement differently than our assistant principal who taught in a different content area than me for a very long time. Expectations can just be different. So this takes the gray area out of things and it lets us have consistent conversations with teachers across the building too. If we're all coaching the same teachers as well, it again just provides consistency of what we expect and then guiding those conversations for us as well.
We also discussed the idea of looking at this in chunks, depending on what level your teacher is at. Like newer teachers, if you were to give them this whole thing and they saw a lot of not yet, that might be kind of feels a little defeating, but looking at it in the chunks of one chunk at a time, two chunks at a time, or what teacher needs would be most helpful to that teacher, I think that could be really beneficial.
Yeah, and again, I just want to stamp that this is not intended to be like an evaluative tool for teachers necessarily. So you might not want to just go like introduce a random new tool and like show a bunch of not yet. That would absolutely feel very deflating for any teacher. But to me, like something that I find really helpful about these kinds of tools is their content specificity. When I was working in schools and districts, a lot of the tools we had were very general. Obviously, you know, they're not going to be content specific just because everybody has to use them to evaluate teachers. And those are helpful for kind of baseline evaluation, but especially these last two videos that you guys watched were both of like pretty strong teachers for the math and ELA, especially for those teachers. When you have a teacher who's already mastered the basics and like great, by all of those, that's when you really want to get into the content specific pedagogy and start to get really nitpicky around those things to help that teacher go from good to great. So that's kind of what I find helpful about this. Are there any other reflections anyone wants to share on this process or how it compares to how you've been coaching teachers? Okay, because we're running a little bit behind on time, we're not going to actually have time to like plan out how you're going to collect videos, but I'm just going to quickly talk through things to think about as for your pre-work for next time, which is just to collect at least one 10-minute video clip. So I'll just quickly go over again why we're doing that and then what to look for in these clips. So just again, a reminder, today we talked about how to identify strong instruction. What we're going to do when we meet in April is everybody will bring at least one video clip, and then we'll do sort of like a mini audit again, share with each other and kind of use these tools to evaluate and discuss what are we seeing and kind of norm on. Is there something in this classroom that maybe I've been missing, or maybe I could dig a little bit deeper here to get more content specific. So for that, our pre-work will be to collect some video samples. So some guidelines for video clips. Ideally, we're looking for videos that are like maximum 10 minutes. I know that's not a very long time, but like we're not going to have in our session time for everybody to watch like a 30-minute video. So aim for max 10 minutes. If you record something longer, if you record a whole lesson, just trim the video down to whatever 10-minute selection you feel captures like and is truly representative of what you regularly see in that teacher's classroom, so that you can get some of your peers' perspective on what you're seeing in there as well. These video clips ideally should be for a priority course and grade that you've named in your school improvement goals. And I would actually recommend whatever course that you collected assignments for our assignment audit, you might just collect a video for that same course. Especially if you've already kind of communicated to that teacher or those teachers kind of the rationale for this, it might just be a little easier to collect video from that same course. And it can give you some interesting information, right? If you rated the assignment strongly, but then you see the instruction is not as strong, that can give you some really useful insight. I already talked about that. And then finally, the video should focus on both the teacher and the student, because as we saw with these tools, we are also looking at like the percentage of students who are engaged in owning their learning. So if we have a video that just follows the teacher around the room for the whole 10 minutes, there's no way we're going to know what percentage of students are actually engaged or owning their learning. So try to capture as much of what students are doing as possible as well. I'll pause here for a second. What questions do we have about our pre-work for next time? Okay, so I actually do, no, we're not going to take time to do this, so we're going to run over. But things to think about as you're kind of planning out how and when you're going to collect these videos. Map out, ideally, if you have like 5 minutes sometime today, to just pop into your Outlook calendar and figure out on this day, when do you have time in the next few weeks to go pop into this classroom and observe, and then kind of backwards plan from there. How are you going to frame this for your teacher and explain it to them ahead of time? And then do you need help from anyone else to do this pre-work? Maybe you are trying to catch video of a teacher who is coached by one of your assistant principals. Maybe you need to like loop them in. So just think about that. And then ideally also we recommend not trying to capture video like 2 days before our next session, because then if you go into their classroom that day and they're giving a test or whatever, like that doesn't give you a lot of time to like go back and collect a second video. So just give yourself some like wiggle room there in case you need to go back. Questions about any of that? Sorry, you can probably hear my husband making weird noises at my baby. Okay, we are gonna close out in a minute, but just like last time, we'd like to give everybody 5 dedicated minutes before we do our closeout to go ahead and fill out the survey so you don't have to worry about it later. So Senya just shared the link in the chat. Take 5 minutes to fill out that survey. Then we'll do a quick share out, and then we'll close out for today.
I have a quick question. How many video clip samples do we need to collect?
Good question. Just one. You can do more if you want, but all you really need to have in the session to share with others is one.
All right, thank you.
Do you have a recommendation for what type of teacher or what type of lesson, like somebody who could benefit from stronger feedback or somebody who's already kind of got it going on?
I think that's up to you. I would think about 2 things kind of immediately pop into my mind that I would think about. One is, what are the courses that are tied to your improvement goals that you want to like have an extra eye on? And then 2 is, which teachers or classrooms would you want some peer feedback on? It might be a strong teacher you have that you're just not sure how to push them further. It might be a teacher you've been struggling to coach for years and you're just stuck on like, I feel like I've given them all the feedback and I don't know what to do now. Because another benefit of this process will be just being able to talk to each other about what you're seeing and get feedback from your colleagues. All right, as you finish your survey, would love to just hear from everyone before you hop off the call. Just share in the chat. If you want to come off mute and share that way, that's fine too. But just share in the chat kind of what's sticking with you as you leave today's community of practice. And then here's just a reminder of our pre-work for April. Record at least one video, and we'll share out the link to where you can upload those videos before the session. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much for your engagement today. Take another minute to share what's sticking with you, and then have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.